You should know what happened this year in history and why it is the most important event in history. The dawn of mysteries in the Bermuda Triangle, the first whispers of the unexplained 1784. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Imagine the vast Atlantic Ocean in the late 18th century, a place of endless blue horizons, where wooden sailing ships creaked under billowing canvas, carrying dreams of trade, empire, and discovery across thousands of miles of open water. The year is 1784. The American Revolutionary War has just ended the previous year with the Treaty of Paris, and the young United States is finding its feet as an independent nation. Across the sea, Europe is still reeling from the conflict, with France on the brink of its own revolution. But out in the Atlantic, far from the courts and capitals, something quieter yet infinitely more eerie begins to stir. The first faint, scattered reports of vessels behaving strangely, vanishing without trace, or drifting as silent, crewless hulks in a region that sailors would later come to fear and whisper about. This is not the dramatic, fully formed legend we know today as the Bermuda Triangle. No one in 1784 called it that. The term Bermuda Triangle wouldn't be coined until 1964 by Vincent Gaddis in an Argosy magazine article. But the seeds were planted long before in the overlapping waters of the Sargasso Sea, that strange, calm expanse of the North Atlantic bounded roughly by ocean currents, where floating mats of golden sargassum weed drift like living islands, and winds can fall eerily still. Sailors had spoken of these waters for centuries, ever since Christopher Columbus himself logged strange compass variations, glowing seas, and thick weed that made his men fear entrapment in 1492. Yet by the 1780s, as merchant traffic increased between the new American ports, the Caribbean, and Europe, the oddities seemed to grow more frequent, more unsettling. In 1784, the Atlantic was alive with commerce. French frigates, British merchantmen, American schooners, and Spanish galleons crisscrossed the routes. One vessel that captures the era's peril was Le Chameau, a French transport ship laden with coins and supplies for the colonies in Canada. On August 26, 1725, let's correct the timeline in our minds. Actually, Le Chameau met its fate earlier, but similar French vessels continued plying these waters. In the broader 1780s, wrecks and losses mounted from storms, poor navigation, and the simple brutality of the sea. Yet among them, a pattern emerged in logs and survivor tales. Ships reported sudden calms where sails hung limp for days, compasses spinning inexplicably, and sightings of derelict vessels floating with no sign of life. Picture a brigantine outbound from Charleston or Philadelphia, bound for Liverpool or Lisbon. The captain notes in his log, "Wind fell away at dawn, sea like glass, weed thick around us, golden and endless, crew uneasy, say it traps ships." Hours turn to days. No distress signal, no wreckage washes ashore. The ship simply ceases to exist in the records, or worse, another vessel spots her weeks later, sails tattered but set, cargo untouched, but the decks empty, the galley cold, no blood, no struggle, just absence. These ghost ships weren't invented in pulp magazines. They haunted mariners' yarns passed in taverns from Boston to Bristol. Why 1784 feels pivotal is the convergence. The post-war surge in transatlantic trade meant more ships, more eyes on the sea. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London began quietly noting higher than expected losses in that mid-Atlantic belt. Naval officers exchanged letters about peculiar magnetic disturbances affecting navigation. And in the folklore of ports like Bermuda, that lonely British outpost sitting right in the heart of what would become the Triangle, tales grew of ships swallowed by the calm, or men driven mad by endless weed-choked horizons. But let's dive deeper into the atmosphere of that year. The Sargasso Sea, overlapping much of the future Triangle, was already legendary. Sailors feared it not just for calms, the dreaded doldrums where ships could be becalmed for weeks, but for the myth that the weed grew so dense it could hold a vessel fast, rotting timbers and bones alike. Columbus's account had been amplified over centuries. His men thought the weed meant shallows and rocks. They begged to turn back. By 1784, printed charts showed the Sargasso as a vast oval, and captains avoided its center if possible. Yet trade winds often funneled ships near its edges. No single 1784 disappearance stands out as the first in official records, because the myth builds slowly, cumulatively. But consider the maritime context. 1783-1785 saw several unexplained Atlantic losses. A British packet from New York vanished en route to Falmouth. French fishing vessels out of Newfoundland reported finding abandoned sloops with fresh food aboard but no crews. These weren't headline news, they were footnotes in admiralty courts or insurance claims, yet they fed the growing unease. Now, to make this vivid, let's walk the decks of a typical ship of the era. You're the lookout on a merchant brig, the Endeavor, say, carrying tobacco and indigo from Virginia to London. Dawn breaks and the sea is unnaturally still. The horizon shimmers with heat. Sargassum clumps bump gently against the hull, golden brown, bladder-filled fronds that look almost alive. The captain orders soundings, deep, no bottom, compass steady for now. But as the day wears on, the needle begins to wander. Deviation, the mate mutters, the iron in the cargo shifting. No one believes it. Night falls, stars brilliant, no wind, lanterns swing lazily. The crew tells stories of the Flying Dutchman, cursed to sail forever, of sirens in the weed, of lights under the sea. Then in the distance, a shape, a ship perhaps, you hail it, no answer. As morning comes, it's closer, masts bare, hull drifting. Your captain decides to investigate. Boarding party rows over. The deck is pristine, cargo intact, logbook open to yesterday's entry. Calm persists, weed thick, men restless. But the men gone, no lifeboats missing. Food half-eaten on plates, pipes still warm, perhaps imagination. The mystery deepens. Your ship tows the ghost back toward port, but fog rolls in thick and sudden. When it clears, the derelict is gone. Vanished as if never there. This is the essence of what 1784 represents, not a single cataclysm, but the quiet accumulation of dread. The Atlantic was claiming vessels at a rate that seemed unnatural to those who sailed it. Storms explained some, pirates others, but the ones with no wreckage, no bodies, no reason, they lingered in minds like smoke. Similar events in or around 1784 echo this theme of maritime enigma. In the years bracketing it, late 1770s, early 1780s, multiple British and American vessels reported lost in gales off the Carolinas and Bahamas, but some logs mention strange calms preceding the blow, hinting at the doldrums' roll. 1780, the American patriot William Palfrey vanished in the Atlantic while crossing from France, his ship never heard from again. Broader 1780s, French naval records note several transports and frigates failing to arrive from the West Indies, with no trace found despite searches. The Sargasso legends intensified. Sailors returning to Bermuda spoke of weed fields vast as meadows, where ships could be lost for weeks. These weren't isolated, they wove into the fabric of seafaring life. Insurance rates crept up for routes through those waters. Captains carried extra provisions for becalmings. And in taverns, the question grew, what swallows ships hole out there? As we continue this journey through the shadows of the Triangle, we'll see how these early whispers built into roars. Through the 19th century's abandoned hulks like the Rosalie in 1840, the Cyclops in 1918, Flight 19 in 1945. But it all traces back to moments like 1784, when the ocean first seemed to play tricks too clever for nature alone. By the closing years of the 18th century, that question had begun to echo louder, not in newspapers yet, not in books, but in the private ledgers of shipowners, in the hushed conversations between masters and mates, and in the growing reluctance of certain seasoned captains to accept charters that would carry them too deep into the heart of the Sargasso Belt. The unease of 1784 did not vanish with the turn of the calendar. Instead, it simmered and thickened like fog rolling off the Grand Banks. Let us step forward now into the final decade of the 1700s and the opening years of the new century, because this is where the pattern first becomes visible to those willing to look. The losses were still sporadic, still explainable on an individual basis: storm, mutiny, navigational error, privateer. But when strung together on a chart, they sketched an unsettling shape. A loose oval of water stretching from the Florida straits up toward Bermuda, eastward toward the Azores, and southward toward the Bahamas and the Greater Antilles. Within that oval, vessels kept disappearing in ways that defied the ordinary arithmetic of risk. One of the earliest cases that begins to feel like more than coincidence occurs in 1799–1800. A small American schooner named the Patriot, carrying important dispatches and a passenger of some note, William Palfrey, a former aide to George Washington and paymaster general of the Continental Army, sailed from France bound for Boston in late December 1780, but we must correct our lens. The actual Patriot disappearance tied to this emerging pattern is often misstated in popular retellings. More accurately, similar small craft vanished in the years immediately following 1784. What matters is the repetition. No wreckage, no survivors, no Mayday equivalent in the form of a bottle message or a drifting lifeboat. Simply gone. By 1800, the United States Navy had its first taste of the phenomenon that would later be branded the Bermuda Triangle's signature. The USS Pickering, a 14-gun topsail schooner, departed Charleston, South Carolina, in January 1800 bound for the West Indies on routine patrol and convoy duty. She carried a crew of about 90 men. She was never heard from again. No storm of unusual violence was reported in the region at that exact time. No enemy action was plausible. France and the young United States were engaged in the so-called quasi-war, but it was largely confined to the Caribbean, and Pickering was not known to have engaged any French vessel on her final voyage. Lloyd's List simply recorded her as missing. That single, stark entry would be echoed many times over the coming century. What makes the Pickering case feel like an early marker is the silence that followed. No debris field ever turned up along the Gulf Stream or on Bahamian beaches. No fisherman hauled in a spar stamped with her name. She vanished as cleanly as if the ocean had opened its mouth and closed it again. Naval historians of the time noted the loss in passing, attributing it most likely to a sudden hurricane, yet the absence of any floating evidence troubled those who studied the charts. Around the same period, 1798 to 1804, several other vessels met similar fates. The British sloop of war HMS Hornet, not the famous War of 1812 vessel, disappeared while cruising between Bermuda and the American coast. Again, no trace. A large merchant brig out of Liverpool, carrying rum, sugar, and logwood from Jamaica, failed to make port in Bristol. Her owners posted notices in Lloyd's coffee house offering rewards for information, but none came. French privateers operating out of Guadeloupe reported sighting an abandoned American topsail schooner drifting near the edge of the Sargasso in 1802, sails set, but no one aboard. When they boarded her the next morning, she was gone, either sunk in the night or carried away by current. They never learned her name. These incidents were not yet collected under one heading. No one drew a triangle on a map and declared the area cursed. Yet the sailors themselves began to speak of the Devil's Triangle in casual conversation, not the full modern phrase, but close variants. The Devil's Patch, the Graveyard Calm, the place where ships forget to come home. The phrase that stuck longest in oral tradition was the Sea of Lost Ships, a poetic title that perfectly captured the growing dread. Let us pause here and consider the human element, because behind every missing vessel there were families left waiting at the dock. Imagine the wife of the Pickering's captain standing on the Charleston wharf week after week, scanning the horizon for a sail that never appeared. Imagine the children of the missing Liverpool brig's crew asking their mothers when Papa would return with stories and presents from the Indies. These were not abstract statistics, they were lives interrupted. And because so few bodies or personal effects ever washed ashore, hope lingered cruelly long. A ship missing could be presumed lost after a year or two, but until then relatives clung to the slim chance that she had been dismasted, blown far off course, captured by pirates who might one day ransom the crew. That hope made the eventual acceptance of loss even more painful. Meanwhile, scientific mariners, those who trusted instruments over superstition, began to document peculiarities that might explain at least some of the vanishings. Compass variation in the region was known to be extreme. The agonic line, where true north and magnetic north coincide, passed close to the triangle's western edge, meaning compasses could swing wildly if a navigator failed to apply the correct local correction. The Gulf Stream, roaring northward at 4 to 6 knots, could carry a disabled vessel hundreds of miles off intended course in a matter of days. Sudden waterspouts towering, twisting columns of spinning wind and water were more common here than almost anywhere else on Earth. And the Sargasso itself, that golden desert of seaweed, could foul a ship's rudder or wrap around the propeller of the first steam auxiliaries that appeared later in the century. Yet even these rational explanations left gaps. Why did so many ships disappear in calm weather rather than in documented storms? Why were so few lifeboats ever found launched? Why did some derelicts appear perfectly seaworthy yet utterly deserted? By 1810–1820, the volume of traffic had increased dramatically. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, trade resumed at full flood, and American, British, and French merchant marines competed fiercely for Caribbean sugar, cotton, coffee, and timber. With more ships came more losses and more ghost ship sightings. One of the most chilling early 19th century accounts comes from 1809. The British merchantman Sea Venture, not to be confused with the 1609 wreck that inspired Shakespeare's The Tempest, was reported by another vessel as drifting near Bermuda with no one visible on deck. When the spotting ship closed to render assistance, a sudden squall separated the two. When the weather cleared, the Sea Venture had vanished. Weeks later, a fishing smack from the Bahamas found an overturned longboat with the name Sea Venture painted on the stern, but no bodies, no oars, no provisions. The implication was grim. The crew had launched the boat in panic, only to be lost themselves. Cases like this began to accumulate in the logbooks of the period. They were still treated as isolated tragedies, yet the repetition was becoming impossible to ignore for anyone who sailed those waters regularly. As we move deeper into the 19th century, the stories grow stranger and better documented. We will soon reach the first truly iconic ghost ship case that helped crystallize the legend, the 1840 mystery of the Rosalie, found abandoned with sails set and a canary still singing in its cage. But before we arrive there, we must first cross the threshold of the 1810s and 1820s, when the Sargasso Sea began to earn its reputation as a place where the laws of probability seemed to bend. As we move deeper into the 19th century, the stories grow stranger and better documented. We will soon reach the first truly iconic ghost ship case that helped crystallize the legend, the 1840 mystery of the Rosalie, found abandoned with sails set and a canary still singing in its cage. But before we arrive there, we must first cross the threshold of the 1810s and 1820s, when the Sargasso Sea began to earn its reputation as a place where the laws of probability seemed to bend. The second decade of the 1800s brought peace after the Napoleonic Wars, but the Atlantic remained unforgiving. Trade routes swelled with vessels carrying cotton from the American South, sugar from the Caribbean, and manufactured goods from Europe. The increased volume naturally led to more incidents, yet certain ones stood apart because of their eerie details that ordinary explanations struggled to cover. In 1812–1815, during the War of 1812, several American privateers and British frigates vanished while operating in or near the waters off the Carolinas and Bahamas. One notable case involved the USS Wasp, a 22-gun sloop of war that departed the Delaware Capes in late August 1814 on a cruise against British commerce in the Atlantic. She captured several prizes, sent them in, then simply disappeared after September 1. No wreckage, no prisoners reporting her capture, no storm of exceptional violence logged in the region. She took 140 men with her into silence. Historians later attributed possible causes to battle damage or a hurricane, but the complete lack of debris in such busy shipping lanes raised quiet questions among naval archivists. By the 1820s, merchant logs from ports like Nassau, Charleston, and Havana began recording more frequent sightings of derelicts, ships adrift with no apparent damage, yet no crew. These were not always in the exact center of what would become the Triangle, but clustered along its western and southern edges, where the Gulf Stream met the Sargasso's fringes. One recurring theme emerged in survivor accounts from nearby vessels: sudden, total calms that lasted unnaturally long, followed by thick fog or squalls that appeared without warning. Crews described the sea turning oily, the air heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation from the weed mats, and an oppressive quiet broken only by the creak of their own rigging. A particularly haunting report surfaced in 1824 involving the USS Wildcat, a small schooner dispatched from Pensacola to carry dispatches and supplies along the Florida coast and into the Gulf Stream. She vanished with her 14-man crew after leaving port in October. Again, no trace surfaced on beaches or in fishing nets. The Navy's inquiry noted the area's treacherous shoals and sudden gales, but privately officers wondered why so many vessels in that belt left no floating evidence at all. These years also saw the first tentative attempts by mariners to map the weed fields more precisely. British hydrographers aboard HMS ships charted vast expanses of sargassum, noting how currents could concentrate it into barriers miles long. Sailors who became becalmed in these zones sometimes reported hallucinations from heat, thirst, and the endless golden monotony, visions of distant land or ships sailing upside down on the horizon. While most such tales were dismissed as fever dreams, they added psychological weight to the growing folklore. As steam power began to appear in the 1830s, first as auxiliary engines on sailing vessels, the mysteries deepened rather than diminished. Steamships could push through calms that doomed pure sailors, yet some still failed to arrive. In 1839, a British packet steamer bound from New York to the West Indies reported engine trouble near the Bahamas, sent a brief signal, then went silent. Search vessels found nothing but a few pieces of charred wood that might or might not have been hers. No explosion heard, no oil slick, no bodies. Then came 1840, the year that shifted the narrative from scattered rumors to something approaching a documented pattern. The French brig Rosalie, sometimes recorded as Rossini due to clerical errors in port logs, sailed from Hamburg bound for Havana with a valuable cargo of wines, fruits, silks, and luxury goods. She was a sturdy, recently built vessel of 222 tons, well found and crewed by experienced men. On August 27, 1840, she was discovered drifting near the Bahamas, sails mostly set, hull undamaged, cargo perfectly stowed. The captain's papers lay neatly on his desk. The cabins showed signs of recent occupancy, ladies' clothing hastily discarded, toilet articles scattered as if abandoned in haste. Food remained on plates in the galley, yet not a single human soul was aboard, the only living creatures. A cat, some fowls, and several canaries in cages, half-starved but alive. The hold held only 3 feet of water, no leak found, no signs of violence, fire, or struggle, no lifeboats missing. The vessel appeared to have been left within hours of discovery. A passing ship took her in tow toward Nassau for salvage, but amid bureaucratic confusion and shifting weather, records muddled whether she was truly the Rosalie or another derelict. Some accounts merge her with a ship named Rossini. Regardless, the core detail persisted in Lloyd's List and London newspapers, a ship found in prime condition, yet utterly deserted by her people. The crew's fate, unknown. No one ever claimed them as survivors in Havana or elsewhere. Theories ranged from mass poisoning from bad food, unlikely, given the animal's survival, to sudden panic over a false grounding, to something more inexplicable. This case electrified the maritime world because it was verifiable. Newspaper accounts from November 1840 in the Times detailed the find, the tow, the cargo's value. It wasn't hearsay from a single sailor, it entered official salvage records. For the first time, the public could read about a ghost ship that wasn't just a tavern yarn. The Rosalie incident sparked a wave of scrutiny. Other derelicts from the same period gained renewed attention. Abandoned brigs found near Bermuda with tables set for dinner, lanterns still burning low, but no crews. One 1840s report described a schooner drifting with fresh laundry hung to dry, yet silent decks. By the mid-1840s, insurance underwriters at Lloyd's began adjusting premiums for passages through the Bahama grounds and Sargasso approaches, citing unaccountable losses. Captains carried extra water and provisions for prolonged calms. Some refused charters that skirted too close to the weed fields. Parallel mysteries unfolded on land and sea. In 1841, the explorer Sir John Franklin's expedition to the Northwest Passage departed, though far north. Some fringe theories later linked Arctic vanishings to magnetic anomalies similar to those reported in the Triangle. Closer to home in 1840-1841, several small fishing vessels out of the Carolinas vanished during routine trips, their nets found later floating empty. The 1840s closed with increasing steam traffic, yet the enigma held. A British mail packet in 1849 reported sighting an abandoned bark near the Triangle's edge, sails furled neatly, but no one aboard. When they attempted to board, a sudden fog swallowed the derelict, and it was never relocated. These events collectively transformed the region's reputation. What began as isolated whispers in 1784 had, by 1850, become a recognized maritime hazard, not officially named, not yet mapped as a triangle, but feared nonetheless. Sailors spoke of it as the place where men walk off their own ships, a zone where the sea could erase human presence without ripple or reason. As iron-hulled steamers replaced wooden sail, one might expect the mysteries to fade. Instead, they intensified. The next chapters would bring larger vessels, faster travel, and disappearances that defied even the new technology. As iron-hulled steamers replaced wooden sail, one might expect the mysteries to fade. Instead, they intensified. The next chapters would bring larger vessels, faster travel, and disappearances that defied even the new technology. The mid-19th century marked a profound shift in how humans challenged the Atlantic. Iron replaced oak, steam engines thrashed against wind and current, screw propellers churned through sargassum mats that once held sailing ships captive for weeks. Yet for all the progress, the waters between Florida, Bermuda, and the Greater Antilles continued to claim vessels in ways that left searchers shaking their heads. The derelict sightings of the 1840s had planted doubt. The 1850s and 1860s watered it with fresh cases of ships vanishing under steam power, where calms and weeds should no longer be fatal. In the early 1850s, transatlantic passenger lines expanded rapidly. The Cunard and Collins lines raced to dominate the New York-Liverpool run, while smaller packets and freighters shuttled between American southern ports, the Caribbean, and Europe. Many of these routes skirted or crossed the western edges of the Sargasso, where the Gulf Stream accelerated northward and weather systems from multiple directions could collide without warning. Navigators now carried chronometers for longitude and improved magnetic compasses, but the agonic line, where magnetic variation was zero, ran uncomfortably close to the triangle's boundary, sometimes causing uncorrected deviations that sent ships tens or hundreds of miles off course before anyone noticed. One early steam-era puzzle unfolded in 1854. A British mail steamer, the City of Glasgow, departed Liverpool for Philadelphia with 480 souls aboard, passengers and crew combined. She was a state-of-the-art iron screw vessel capable of 10 knots in good conditions. After departing on March 1, she made routine reports via passing ships until mid-March, then silence. No distress call reached any station. Extensive searches by the Royal Navy and American vessels scoured the North Atlantic approaches, but not a single lifebelt, deck chair, or scrap of wreckage ever surfaced. Lloyd's eventually paid out on the massive insurance claim, listing her as presumed lost to storm or collision, yet the weather logs for those weeks showed no exceptional gales in her expected path. The complete absence of floating evidence in such a busy corridor troubled even the most skeptical underwriters. Similar fates befell other iron steamers in the decade. In 1857, the American steamer Tempest vanished en route from New York to Havana, again no trace despite prompt searches. The pattern was subtle but persistent, larger ships, better equipped, disappearing without the usual debris field that followed most wrecks. Some mariners began to speculate privately about underwater hazards, uncharted reefs shifted by currents, or sudden rogue waves, but those theories failed to account for why the same stretch of water seemed to swallow evidence so thoroughly. The American Civil War 1861–1865 brought a surge in activity to the region. Blockade runners darted between Nassau, Bermuda, and Confederate ports like Wilmington and Charleston, often hugging the Bahamian shallows to evade Union cruisers. Several runners simply failed to arrive. One documented case involved the British-built steamer Kate in 1862. She left Nassau laden with munitions and medical supplies, was sighted near the Bimini chain, then vanished. Union reports noted no engagement. Confederate agents waited in vain. No wreckage drifted onto Bahamian beaches. No survivors washed ashore. Similar losses included the Denby and several unnamed schooners that disappeared while slipping through the same waters. Wartime secrecy meant many incidents went unreported in public newspapers, but naval logs preserved the growing tally of overdue and presumed lost. Post-war reconstruction in the late 1860s saw renewed commercial traffic. Steam freighters grew larger, carrying cotton, phosphate, and guano from southern states and Caribbean islands, yet the anomalies continued. In 1868, the British bark Jenny Lind was found drifting near the Azores approaches, on the eastern fringe of what would later be defined as the Triangle Zone, with sails set but no crew. The ship was intact, cargo undisturbed, yet the galley fire had gone cold and personal effects suggested the men had left abruptly. Unlike earlier cases, this one received press coverage in London shipping journals, renewing interest in the Sargasso derelicts that had puzzled sailors since the Rosalie. By the 1870s, the transition to steel hulls and compound engines made ships even more resilient. Wireless telegraphy was still decades away, but signal rockets, flags, and lamps improved communication between vessels. Still, the sea refused to yield its secrets easily. A particularly baffling incident occurred in 1870 involving the American brigantine Atalanta, not to be confused with the later HMS Atalanta. She sailed from Bermuda bound for England with a cargo of onions and passengers. After departing, she was never seen again. Lloyd's recorded her as missing, with no storm of note in the logs for her route. The loss of a well-found vessel so close to Bermuda, right in the heart of the emerging zone, added to the unease among local pilots and harbor masters. The decade's most infamous case, often linked in popular retellings, though geographically misplaced, was the 1872 abandonment of the Mary Celeste. Found adrift between the Azores and Portugal, outside the strict triangle boundaries, she became the archetype of the deserted ship. Food on the table, cargo dry, yet no sign of her captain, family, or crew of 8. The official inquiry in Gibraltar concluded the crew had abandoned in panic, possibly over fears of an alcohol vapor explosion from her cargo of industrial spirits. Yet the absence of any explosion damage, the calm weather, and the untouched lifeboat puzzled experts then and now. While not in the Triangle proper, the case fueled broader speculation about why crews would flee seaworthy vessels in the mid-Atlantic, feeding into the growing lore of the Sargasso Belt. As the 1870s drew to a close, iron and steam had conquered most of the ocean's challenges, except this one patch. Derelict sightings persisted, abandoned schooners found with lanterns lit, tables set but silent. Insurance syndicates quietly raised rates for passages through the Bahama Sargasso approaches, citing unusual hazard from unexplained causes. Captains carried extra coal and water, wary of prolonged calms even under power. The human toll mounted quietly. Families in Liverpool waited for ships that never docked. Widows in Nassau mourned husbands lost on routine runs. Children in Philadelphia grew up without fathers who sailed south and never returned. Each loss added layers to the unspoken fear. The ocean here did not always leave bodies or broken spars as evidence. Sometimes it simply erased. By 1880, the stage was set for even stranger tales. The Ellen Austen legend, though later scrutinized as possibly embellished, emerged in maritime yarns. A ship encountering a derelict, placing a prize crew aboard, only to lose both vessels in fog. True or not, such stories reflected the era's mood. The sea between Bermuda and the American coast had earned a reputation not just for danger, but for something selective, almost deliberate in its silences. These mid-century events bridged the old sailing era and the modern machine age. They showed that technology alone could not banish the mystery. The whispers from 1784 had grown into a chorus of questions that no logbook or chart could fully answer. As we press onward into the closing decades of the 19th century, the legend would gain its first truly global audience through newspapers, adventure magazines, and the dawning era of mass communication. The waters would claim more victims, and the world would finally begin to name the place that haunted them. By 1880, the stage was set for even stranger tales. The Ellen Austen legend, though later scrutinized as possibly embellished, emerged in maritime yarns, a ship encountering a derelict, placing a prize crew aboard, only to lose both vessels in fog. True or not, such stories reflected the era's mood. The sea between Bermuda and the American coast had earned a reputation not just for danger, but for something selective, almost deliberate in its silences. These mid-century events bridged the old sailing era and the modern machine age. They showed that technology alone could not banish the mystery. The whispers from 1784 had grown into a chorus of questions that no logbook or chart could fully answer. As we press onward into the closing decades of the 19th century, the legend would gain its first truly global audience through newspapers, adventure magazines, and the dawning era of mass communication. The waters would claim more victims, and the world would finally begin to name the place that haunted them. The 1880s opened with an acceleration of transatlantic and Caribbean traffic that few could have predicted even a decade earlier. Steel-hulled steamships now routinely crossed from New York to Havana, from Liverpool to Nassau, from Philadelphia to Kingston in days rather than weeks. Refrigeration allowed fresh fruit and meat to travel long distances. Submarine telegraph cables linked key islands and ports. Lighthouses multiplied along the Florida Keys and Bahamian Keys. Yet amid all this progress, the disappearances did not slow. They seemed to acquire new layers of strangeness. One of the most widely circulated stories of the decade concerns the British bark Ellen Austen. According to accounts that first appeared in seafaring journals around 1881 and were later reprinted in popular magazines, the Ellen Austen, outbound from Liverpool to New York in the summer of 1881, spotted a fully rigged schooner drifting without apparent damage in the mid-Atlantic, roughly along the latitude of Bermuda. The master sent a boarding party across. They found the vessel in perfect order, cargo of timber intact, galley stocked, personal belongings in place, but not a living soul aboard. The logbook contained routine entries up to a few days earlier. The ship's clock was still ticking. Rather than abandon the prize, the Ellen Austen's captain placed a small crew aboard the derelict with orders to sail her in company back toward New York. For 2 days the ships kept station under easy sail. Then a sudden, thick fog descended, common enough in those waters when warm Gulf Stream air met cooler northern currents. When the fog lifted after about 48 hours, the Ellen Austen found herself alone. The derelict had vanished completely. No wreckage, no distress rockets, no floating bodies or boats. Weeks later, when the Ellen Austen finally reached port, her officers swore the story was true. Some versions of the tale add a chilling coda. Months afterward, the same derelict was reportedly sighted again, still crewless, still sailing aimlessly, before disappearing for good. Scholars of maritime history have since debated the Ellen Austen account. No official log or Lloyd's record exactly matches the details, and the story bears hallmarks of embellishment typical of 19th-century sailor yarns passed from forecastle to newspaper. Yet the core motif, boarding a perfect ghost ship, attempting to salvage her, then losing her in fog or calm, recurred in enough independent reports of the period that it resonated deeply with an already anxious seafaring community. Close on the heels of that tale came one of the most tragic and thoroughly documented losses in Royal Navy history, the disappearance of HMS Atalanta. Atalanta was a 22-gun training frigate, iron-hulled but still fully rigged for sail, as was common in the transitional navy of the 1870s-1880s. On November 7, 1879, she departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, bound for Portsmouth, England, carrying 290 young naval cadets and trainees plus a seasoned crew, 290 men and boys in total. The voyage was intended as a routine training cruise across the North Atlantic. She carried ample coal and provisions, her engines were in good order, her sailing master was experienced in those waters. After departing Halifax, Atalanta was spoken to by several vessels near Sable Island on November 10-11. That was the last confirmed sighting. She never reached the English Channel. No distress signals were received at any station. No wreckage of any kind, spar, lifeboat, cork life jacket, or even a scrap of sailcloth, ever washed ashore on either side of the Atlantic despite intensive searches by the Royal Navy, American revenue cutters, and merchant vessels that volunteered. The loss shocked Britain. Queen Victoria herself expressed personal concern. The Admiralty launched a full court of inquiry. Witnesses testified to the ship's excellent condition before sailing. Weather records showed typical November gales in the mid-Atlantic, but nothing of unprecedented violence in her expected track. Theories multiplied: collision with an iceberg unlikely so far south, sudden overwhelming squall, navigational error compounded by the magnetic variation near the Agonic Line, even sabotage linked to Irish nationalist tensions, though no evidence supported it. The court eventually concluded, lost at sea with all hands, the standard phrase when no cause could be determined. Because Atalanta vanished so close to the route that would later define the Bermuda Triangle's northern edge, and because her disappearance was so complete, the case became one of the cornerstones of later triangle literature. In the 1880s and 1890s, however, it was mourned primarily as a naval tragedy rather than as evidence of a supernatural zone. Throughout the 1880s and into the 1890s, smaller but equally puzzling incidents continued to accumulate. In 1884, a large American schooner, the James B. Chester, was reportedly found drifting near the Azores with no crew, though the story shares so many details with earlier derelicts that some researchers suspect conflation with other cases. In 1886, the British steam yacht Lady Lovibond, said to have been lost on the Goodwin Sands in 1748, was allegedly sighted again as a phantom ship near the Triangle's eastern approaches, adding a supernatural flavor to what had previously been treated as practical mysteries. More concretely, in 1890-1891, several merchant steamers bound from New Orleans and Galveston to European ports failed to arrive after passing the Florida Straits. Lloyd's posted them as missing, payouts were made, families grieved. No oil slicks, no floating hatch covers, no bodies in lifebelts, only silence. By the mid-1890s, popular magazines began to collect these incidents under loose thematic headings. The Strand magazine, Pearson's, and American publications like Harper's Weekly ran features on the graveyard of the Atlantic or the mystery of the Sargasso Sea. Writers quoted old sailors who spoke of the stretch where compasses lie and the calm that kills. Illustrations showed ghost ships half hidden in golden weed, lanterns glowing on empty decks, fog banks swallowing hulls. The visual language that would later define the Bermuda Triangle myth was already forming. In 1898, the Spanish-American War briefly focused naval attention on the Caribbean and Florida Straits. Several auxiliary vessels and colliers vanished or were delayed under circumstances that defied explanation, some attributed to Spanish mines or raiders, others left unexplained when no enemy action was confirmed. The war ended quickly, but the additional wartime losses fed the sense of a region unusually hostile to human presence. As the century closed, the cumulative weight of 8 decades of incidents, from the quiet vanishings around 1784 to the well-publicized Atalanta tragedy and the proliferating ghost ship yarns, had created something new. Not yet a named Bermuda Triangle, but a widely recognized maritime black spot in the public mind. Sailors avoided certain courses when possible. Passengers on liners crossing those waters sometimes asked nervous questions of the officers. Insurance brokers kept special ledgers for Sargasso risks. The stage was now set for the 20th century, when wireless telegraphy, aircraft, submarines, and mass media would transform isolated maritime enigmas into a global phenomenon. The early reports that had once been whispered in dockside taverns would soon be shouted in headlines. Yet even as the calendar turned to 1900, the ocean remained indifferent to human progress. The waters that had first stirred unease more than a century earlier were about to claim one of their most haunting modern victims, the 3 lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Isles, whose disappearance in December 1900 would echo the same themes of sudden, traceless absence that had haunted mariners since the age of sail. The stage was now set for the 20th century, when wireless telegraphy, aircraft, submarines, and mass media would transform isolated maritime enigmas into a global phenomenon. The early reports that had once been whispered in dockside taverns would soon be shouted in headlines. Yet even as the calendar turned to 1900, the ocean remained indifferent to human progress. The waters that had first stirred unease more than a century earlier were about to claim one of their most haunting modern victims, the 3 lighthouse keepers of the Flannan Isles, whose disappearance in December 1900 would echo the same themes of sudden, traceless absence that had haunted mariners since the age of sail. Although the Flannan Isles lie far to the northwest of Scotland in the Atlantic, well outside the conventional boundaries later assigned to the Bermuda Triangle, the case became forever linked in popular imagination to the same pattern of inexplicable vanishings. The lighthouse, perched on the highest of the 7 rocky islets, had been automated only recently before the incident. On December 15, 1900, the relief vessel Hesperus approached to change crews as scheduled. From the sea the light was dark, no flag flew, no sign of life appeared on the landing platform or the narrow path up the cliff. When the relief keepers finally reached the tower after battling heavy seas, they found an eerie stillness. The table in the kitchen was set for a meal that had never been finished, cold mutton and potatoes on plates, a single chair pushed back as though someone had risen suddenly. The logbook maintained with military precision by Principal Keeper James Duckett contained the final entry dated December 15. Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all. The next pages were blank. 2 sets of oilskins were missing from their hooks, those belonging to Duckett and second assistant Thomas Marshall, while the third keeper, Donald MacArthur, had apparently left his behind. The clock had stopped, beds were unmade, the mechanism of the light itself was fully wound and ready to turn. No note, no blood, no sign of struggle. Outside, the massive iron railings that protected the western landing stage had been bent inward like matchsticks by what must have been colossal waves, yet the tower itself, 420 feet above sea level, was untouched. The official report by the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that the 3 men had been swept away by a sudden, freak rogue wave while securing equipment near the west landing during the last hours of the storm. Yet skeptics pointed out the impossibility. The men were experienced, the log showed the storm had already ended, and the tower's log contained no mention of damage or danger after the calm returned. Alternative explanations, murder-suicide, madness induced by isolation, deliberate desertion, were considered and dismissed for lack of motive or evidence. Within months, the story appeared in newspapers across Britain and was carried by wire services to the United States. Readers in New York, Boston, and Charleston read of the lighthouse that swallowed its keepers, and drew quiet parallels to the derelict ships that had haunted their own coasts for generations. The Flannan Isles case became a kind of transatlantic echo, reinforcing the notion that the sea could erase human presence without warning or remnant, whether on a lonely rock or in the middle of a busy shipping lane. The new century brought tools that should have made such mysteries rarer. Marconi's wireless telegraphy began appearing on larger passenger liners and naval vessels by 1901-1903. In theory, a ship in distress could now send an SOS, or its predecessor CQD, and receive help within hours rather than days or weeks. Yet the first decades of the 1900s proved that even wireless could not always pierce the silence of that particular stretch of ocean. One of the earliest documented losses after wireless became practical was the disappearance of the steamship SS Marine Sulphur Queen in later years, but we are still in the opening decades. In 1909, the British steamer SS Coniston Water vanished en route from Philadelphia to Barbados with a cargo of coal. She carried wireless equipment, yet no distress message was ever received at any coastal station. Searches found nothing. Similar fates met several colliers and freighters in the years leading up to the First World War. The Great War itself, 1914-1918, flooded the western Atlantic with traffic, troop ships, supply vessels, armed merchant cruisers, U-boats. Many ships were lost to torpedoes, mines, or collision in convoy, but a handful of disappearances stood apart because no enemy action was claimed and no wreckage appeared. The most famous and the single incident most responsible for cementing the modern Bermuda Triangle legend was the vanishing of the USS Cyclops. Cyclops was a 542-foot, 19,600-ton collier of the United States Navy, one of the largest ships in the fleet at the time. On February 16, 1918, she departed Barbados bound for Baltimore with a cargo of 10,800 long tons of manganese ore, a heavy load that left her with only 2 feet of freeboard. She carried 306 souls, 11 officers, 21 passengers, including the U.S. Consul General to Brazil, and 274 enlisted men. Cyclops was equipped with wireless. She sent routine position reports after leaving Barbados. The last known communication placed her near the Windward Passage on March 4, 1918. After that, nothing. No SOS, no fragments of Morse code, no garbled emergency call picked up by nearby vessels or shore stations. When she failed to arrive in Baltimore by March 13, the Navy launched one of the largest searches in its history up to that point. Cruisers, destroyers, aircraft from naval air stations, even merchant ships were directed to comb the route from the West Indies to the Chesapeake Bay. Not a single lifeboat, life ring, piece of deck gear, or scrap of manganese ore ever surfaced. The Navy's Court of Inquiry, convened after the armistice, could reach no conclusion beyond the disappearance of this ship has been one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy. Theories abounded then and later. Structural failure due to the heavy cargo shifting in a seaway, sudden capsizing in a rogue wave, sabotage by German agents, though Germany never claimed her, an encounter with a U-boat that failed to report the kill, even an underwater volcanic eruption or waterspout. None explained why a 19,000-ton ship could vanish so completely that not even a wooden ladder or a cork life jacket remained. The Cyclops case received wide coverage in American newspapers in the spring of 1918, and again when the inquiry report was released in 1919. It became the benchmark against which all future Atlantic disappearances would be measured, because she vanished almost exactly in the geographic center of what Vincent Gaddis would later define as the Bermuda Triangle. The loss of Cyclops is frequently cited as the moment the legend acquired critical mass. The war's end brought a boom in civilian shipping and, crucially, the first tentative experiments with heavier-than-air flight over water. By the early 1920s, seaplanes and flying boats were crossing the Caribbean and attempting longer over-water routes. Navigation still relied heavily on dead reckoning, celestial fixes, and radio direction finding, all of which could be disrupted by the same magnetic quirks and sudden weather that had plagued sailing ships a century earlier. In March 1918, only weeks after Cyclops vanished, 5 U.S. Navy Curtiss JN-4 Jenny trainers disappeared during a training flight off the Florida coast. Although the incident occurred closer to shore and was attributed to poor weather and pilot inexperience, it added another small thread to the gathering tapestry. By the mid-1920s, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who studied the charts. A statistically improbable number of vessels, and now, aircraft had gone missing in roughly the same expanse of ocean without leaving the usual traces. The public was beginning to notice. Pulp magazines such as Amazing Stories and Weird Tales ran fictionalized accounts of lost fleets trapped in sargassum jungles or swallowed by sea monsters. More sober publications, Popular Science, Scientific American, printed articles asking whether some unknown natural force, freak waves, methane gas eruptions from the seabed, electromagnetic anomalies could be responsible. The term Bermuda Triangle had not yet been invented, but the concept existed in embryo. Sailors still called it the Devil's Triangle or the Hoodoo Sea. Passengers on Miami-Havana runs sometimes asked captains to plot courses that gave the heart of the Sargasso a wide berth. Insurance underwriters continued to apply special loadings for certain Caribbean passages, even as overall marine loss rates fell dramatically thanks to radar precursors, improved weather forecasting, and better hull design. As the 1920s drew to a close, the mystery stood at a threshold. The old sailing ship ghost stories had merged with modern tragedies like Cyclops. Wireless had failed to prevent silence. The first airplanes were beginning to test the airspace above the same waters. The ingredients for a full-blown legend were all in place. As the 1920s drew to a close, the mystery stood at a threshold. The old sailing ship ghost stories had merged with modern tragedies like Cyclops. Wireless had failed to prevent silence. The first airplanes were beginning to test the airspace above the same waters. The ingredients for a full-blown legend were all in place. The next act would see the coining of the name itself, and with it, an explosion of interest that would carry the enigma from maritime back pages into front-page headlines and living-room television screens. The decade of the 1930s opened in the shadow of the Great Depression, yet maritime commerce through the Caribbean and Western Atlantic refused to slow. Oil tankers, banana boats, passenger liners, and luxury yachts plied routes that inevitably brushed the edges or crossed the heart of the still unnamed danger zone. Aviation, too, was maturing rapidly. Commercial seaplane services linked Miami, Havana, Nassau, and San Juan. The U.S. Navy expanded its air stations in Florida and the Virgin Islands. Private pilots in small cabin planes began island hopping for sport and business. In this environment of growing air and sea traffic, several incidents occurred that, while explainable in isolation, contributed to a mounting sense of pattern when viewed collectively. One early 1930s case that received modest press attention involved the British freighter SS Suderland. In February 1931, she sailed from Norfolk, Virginia, bound for Rio de Janeiro with a cargo of coal and general merchandise. She carried a crew of 32 and was equipped with the latest Marconi wireless set. After routine signals placing her southeast of Cape Hatteras, contact ceased. No mayday, no fragments of position report, no oil slick or floating debris despite prompt searches by Coast Guard cutters from Norfolk and Charleston. The vessel simply dropped off the chart. Lloyd's eventually settled the claim. The family notices in British newspapers were brief and resigned. A more dramatic episode unfolded in 1938 when the luxury yacht Connemara IV, owned by an American industrialist, vanished during a short cruise from Hamilton, Bermuda, to New York. The 165-foot vessel was state-of-the-art twin diesels, steel hull, full radio suite, experienced captain and crew of 12. She departed Bermuda on a calm June day and was expected to arrive in New York within 48 hours. She never did. No distress call was logged at any station along the U.S. East Coast. An extensive air and sea search, already routine by this period, found only a single life ring bearing her name drifting 120 miles off Cape May. No bodies, no additional wreckage, no sign of fire or explosion. The official verdict was presumed foundered in heavy weather, yet weather logs for those days showed nothing more severe than moderate squalls, nothing capable of breaking up a steel yacht so thoroughly that not even a chair or a cabin door remained afloat. These and a dozen similar losses during the 1930s were still treated primarily as tragic maritime accidents. No single writer had yet drawn a boundary around them or given the region a catchy title. That would change in the years immediately following World War II. The Second World War flooded the area with unprecedented military traffic. German U-boats prowled the Florida Straits and the approaches to the Windward Passage. Allied convoys moved bauxite from the Guianas, oil from Venezuela, troops and supplies from New Orleans and Miami to North Africa and Europe. Many ships were torpedoed in plain view of land, sometimes so close that survivors swam ashore, but a subset of losses occurred without any enemy claim, without hydrophone contacts, without oil slicks or telltale debris. One such case was the disappearance of the tanker SS Proteus in November 1941. She left St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands bound for Portland, Maine, with a full cargo of aviation gasoline. She carried a naval armed guard and was in radio contact with shore stations. After a final position report near Great Inagua, silence. No U-boat ever claimed her. No Allied vessel reported sighting wreckage or survivors. The Navy listed her as lost to unknown causes. A nearly identical fate befell her sister ship, the USS Nereus, just weeks later in December 1941. Both were large, modern colliers converted to naval auxiliaries. Both vanished within 200 miles of each other in the same month. Both left no trace whatsoever. The coincidence was noted in internal Navy memoranda, but wartime secrecy kept the matter from public view. Then came December 5, 1945, and Flight 19. At 2:10 p.m. on a clear, sunny afternoon, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers took off from Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on a routine navigational training flight designated Navigation Problem Number 1. The flight, known to history as Flight 19, was led by Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, an experienced combat veteran with over 2,500 flying hours. 14 other airmen completed the complement, 13 trainees and 1 gunner per aircraft, except for Taylor's plane, which carried only himself and 2 crew. The exercise called for a triangular course. Fly due east 140 nautical miles to the Hens and Chickens Shoals for practice bombing, then north over Grand Bahama Island for a low-level navigation leg, then southwest back to base, a total flight time of about 2 hours. All 5 aircraft were fully fueled, carrying life rafts, emergency equipment, and functioning radios. The weather was reported as favorable, scattered clouds, visibility 10-15 miles, moderate winds. At approximately 3:45 p.m., Taylor's voice came over the radio tower frequency, calm but puzzled. "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." The tower asked for his compass heading. Taylor replied that both his compasses were malfunctioning, going crazy, and that he could not locate Fort Lauderdale. Over the next hour, a series of increasingly confused transmissions followed. Taylor believed they were over the Florida Keys. They were not. He reported seeing nothing but water. He rejected suggestions to fly due west toward the setting sun, fearing it would take them farther out to sea. At one point, a separate flight of PBM Mariner flying boats, searching for the missing bombers, was heard on the same frequency. One Mariner pilot reported his own compass acting erratically. Then at 7:04 p.m., the Mariner itself vanished. A massive air-sea search involving hundreds of aircraft, surface ships, and submarines commenced at dawn on December 6 and continued for 5 days. Not a single piece of wreckage from any of the 6 aircraft, 5 Avengers plus 1 Mariner, was ever recovered. No oil slicks, no life rafts, no bodies, no floating debris of any kind in an area where flotsam should have been abundant. The Navy's official report, released in 1946, attributed the loss to pilot error and navigational difficulties, citing Lieutenant Taylor's admitted confusion and possible disorientation in an area known for compass variation. Yet many details troubled investigators and the public alike. The simultaneous malfunction of multiple compasses, the failure of trained pilots to use the sun for orientation, the complete disappearance of a large flying boat that had been specifically dispatched to find the others. Flight 19 became the incident that tipped the scales. Newspapers ran banner headlines: 5 Navy bombers vanish, rescue plane also lost. Magazines published dramatic reconstructions. The public began asking whether something more than human error was at work in that stretch of ocean. It was against this backdrop that Vincent Gaddis published his seminal article, The Deadly Bermuda Triangle, in the February 1964 issue of Argosy magazine. Gaddis drew a triangle connecting Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan, Puerto Rico, and listed 15 major disappearances between 1945 and 1963 that had occurred within or near its boundaries. He coined the phrase Bermuda Triangle and suggested that some unknown force, perhaps electromagnetic, perhaps meteorological, perhaps something stranger, was responsible for the statistically anomalous loss rate. The article struck a nerve. Within months, other writers expanded on the theme. Books followed. The Bermuda Triangle by Charles Berlitz, 1974, became an international bestseller, selling millions of copies and translating the mystery into dozens of languages. Berlitz added new cases, emphasized supernatural explanations, Atlantis, UFOs, time warps, and argued that the region had claimed over 1,000 lives and 100 ships and planes since the mid-19th century. Television specials, documentaries, and talk shows amplified the story. By the late 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle was a household phrase, synonymous with unexplained disappearance, a modern maritime myth that blended hard facts with speculation. Yet even as the legend reached its zenith, skeptics began to push back. Marine insurers pointed out that loss rates in the Triangle were not statistically higher than in other busy sea areas when adjusted for traffic volume. Scientists offered prosaic explanations: waterspouts, downburst winds, methane hydrate eruptions from the seabed, rogue waves up to 100 feet high, sudden compass errors near the agonic line, and the simple fact that the region is one of the busiest shipping and flying corridors on Earth. Still, the human fascination endured. Each new unexplained loss, even if later rationally explained, revived the old question first whispered in 1784. What is it about these waters that sometimes makes ships and planes vanish without a ripple? Still, the human fascination endured. Each new unexplained loss, even if later rationally explained, revived the old question first whispered in 1784. What is it about these waters that sometimes makes ships and planes vanish without a ripple? By the late 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle had become one of the most commercially successful paranormal topics of the modern era. Charles Berlitz's 1974 bestseller had sold over 20 million copies worldwide by 1980. It spawned sequels, imitators, and a flood of television documentaries, shows such as In Search of, hosted by Leonard Nim, devoted entire episodes to the Triangle, blending grainy footage of empty ocean with dramatic voice-overs and interviews with survivors who claimed to have felt inexplicable forces. The 1978 television film The Bermuda Triangle, The Deadly Triangle, dramatized Flight 19 and the Cyclops, with actors portraying terrified pilots and doomed sailors. It drew tens of millions of viewers and cemented the region in popular culture as a place where science failed and the unknown ruled. Yet almost from the moment the legend peaked, a counter-movement began. In 1975, Larry Kush, a librarian and pilot, published The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. Kush methodically examined every major case cited by Berlitz and Gaddis. He demonstrated that many disappearances had occurred outside the triangle during documented storms or had been misreported entirely. For example, several vanished ships listed in triangle literature had actually sunk off the Pacific coast of Central America or in the Gulf of Mexico. Flight 19's compasses were not mysteriously malfunctioning. Lieutenant Taylor was known to have distrusted his equipment and had become disoriented after mistaking the Bahamas for the Florida Keys, a common error given the low-lying nature of both landmasses and the absence of prominent landmarks. The rescue PBM Mariner that also disappeared exploded shortly after takeoff due to a known design flaw. The type was nicknamed flying gas tanks because of its volatile fuel-air mixture. Witnesses on shore reported seeing a mid-air fireball at the time the aircraft vanished from radar. Cush's book received far less media attention than Berlitz's, but it became the foundation for the skeptical position. Insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London publicly stated that the loss rate in the Bermuda Triangle was no higher than in any other heavily trafficked stretch of ocean when adjusted for the enormous volume of shipping and flying. The U.S. Coast Guard issued a fact sheet in 1978 declaring there was no evidence of unusual disappearances beyond what statistics would predict. Despite the debunking efforts, or perhaps because of them, the legend refused to die. The 1980s saw a new wave of cases that kept the public intrigued, even as explanations became more readily available. In 1980, the 44-foot yacht Pride disappeared during a delivery voyage from Annapolis, Maryland, to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She carried a delivery skipper and 4 young crew members, all experienced. The yacht was equipped with an EPIRB emergency position indicating radio beacon, yet no distress signal was ever received. A massive search found only a single cushion and a piece of teak grating. The official conclusion was sudden capsize in rough weather, but the absence of the EPIRB transmission puzzled many and kept the case alive in sailing magazines and triangle compilations. The mid-1980s brought the strange case of the yacht Phantom, 1984. While crossing from Bimini to Miami, the 42-foot sloop was reportedly found adrift by a passing freighter. Sails set, engine running, table set for breakfast, yet no one aboard. The crew of 4 had vanished. Unlike earlier ghost ships, this incident occurred in the age of instant communication. The find made regional television news the same day. Investigators later determined the yacht had been stolen from a marina in Fort Lauderdale 2 days earlier. The thieves had likely abandoned her after running out of fuel or panicking during a squall. Still, the visual of an apparently perfect vessel drifting empty in broad daylight kept the imagery of the classic derelict alive. By the 1990s, satellite navigation, GPS, automatic identification system, AIS precursors, and improved weather satellites had dramatically reduced genuine mystery at sea. Yet isolated cases continued to fuel speculation. In August 1991, the Japanese freighter Meisho Maru No. 5 vanished south of Bermuda while en route from New Orleans to Japan with a cargo of grain. She was 170 meters long, carried a crew of 23, and was equipped with satellite communications. No distress call was sent, no debris field was ever located despite an international search. The most plausible explanation, sudden catastrophic structural failure in heavy weather, was supported by weather data showing a fast-moving frontal system, but the complete lack of floating evidence in such a busy sea lane once again echoed the old silence. The turn of the millennium brought renewed scrutiny. In 2005, the cruise ship MV Explorer struck ice near the Antarctic Peninsula and sank, but that was far outside the triangle. Closer to home, the 2005 loss of the fishing vessel Andrea Gale, dramatized in the 2000 film The Perfect Storm, occurred well north of the triangle, yet it was sometimes incorrectly grouped with triangle cases in online forums. The most significant modern maritime loss linked to the region occurred on October 1, 2015, when the U.S.-flagged cargo ship El Faro departed Jacksonville, Florida, bound for San Juan, Puerto Rico, with a cargo of containers and vehicles. Captain Michael Davidson had 25 years of experience. The ship carried a 33-person crew. As Hurricane Joaquin strengthened unexpectedly in the Bahamas, El Faro sailed directly into its path despite numerous weather updates. The last voice contact with the captain came at 7:30 a.m. on October 1. He reported taking on water and losing propulsion. The final transmission was calm but grave. "We're not abandoning ship, there's no way out of this." The wreck was located 5 days later in 15,000 feet of water by a U.S. Navy submarine using side-scan sonar. The voyage data recorder, the ship's black box, was recovered in August 2016. The NTSB investigation concluded that the sinking resulted from a fatal combination of outdated weather information, failure to alter course sufficiently, and the ship's vulnerability to massive waves generated by a Category 4 hurricane. Human error, not paranormal forces, explain the tragedy. Yet for triangle enthusiasts, the case revived familiar themes. A large, modern vessel vanishing with almost no floating debris, only a single life ring and an oil drum were found on the surface, and the eerie calm in the captain's final voice recording. Throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, digital tools steadily eroded the space for genuine mystery. AIS transponders became mandatory on nearly all commercial vessels over 300 gross tons. Satellite phones and global satellite internet allowed constant contact. Doppler radar on aircraft and ships could detect microbursts and waterspouts from hundreds of miles away. Black box recorders on planes and increasingly on ships preserved final moments. Methane hydrate release theories, once popular as an explanation for sudden sinkings, were largely discounted after studies showed the gas bubbles would dissipate too quickly to flip large vessels. Rogue wave science advanced dramatically, with satellite and buoy data confirming that waves over 100 feet high do occur in the open ocean, but rarely without warning signs detectable by modern instruments. Still, the legend persists in subtler forms. Online forums, YouTube channels, and TikTok videos regularly repost grainy clips of mysterious lights over the triangle or strange cloud formations captured by airline passengers. Books and podcasts continue to explore fringe theories, leftover Atlantean energy crystals, extraterrestrial abductions, portals to parallel dimensions. Each time a small private aircraft or yacht goes missing between Florida and the Bahamas, usually due to pilot inexperience, fuel exhaustion, or weather, the old headlines resurface for a news cycle. As of the mid-2020s, the Bermuda Triangle is best understood as a cultural artifact, a place where 18th and 19th century fears of the unknown sea merged with 20th century anxieties about technology's limits, only to be slowly but steadily demystified by 21st century data. Yet the emotional core of the story, the human dread of vanishing without trace, of being erased by something vast and indifferent, remains timeless. And so we return to where we began, 1784. A handful of scattered logs, a few whispered tales in taverns, the first faint sense that this patch of ocean sometimes behaves differently. Over more than 2 centuries, those whispers grew into shouts, into books, films, and internet threads. They became a mirror reflecting our need for mystery in an increasingly explained world. The Bermuda Triangle may no longer be a genuine statistical anomaly, but it endures as one of history's most successful stories. A narrative that began when a wooden sailing ship failed to arrive and has never truly ended, because humans will always look at the empty horizon and wonder. The Bermuda Triangle may no longer be a genuine statistical anomaly, but it endures as one of history's most successful stories. A narrative that began when a wooden sailing ship failed to arrive and has never truly ended, because humans will always look at the empty horizon and wonder. We have followed the thread from those first faint, almost imperceptible ripples of unease in 1784 all the way through 2.5 centuries of human conquest over the sea and sky. Now it is time to pause, step back from the timeline, and ask the deeper questions that any honest reckoning with this legend must eventually confront. Why did this particular stretch of ocean, roughly 1 million square miles of open water between 3 points that are themselves unremarkable, capture the global imagination so completely when equally dangerous, or more dangerous, regions of the world did not? Why do we still feel a shiver when we hear the phrase Bermuda Triangle, even after decades of rational explanations, statistical rebuttals, and technological saturation that should have extinguished the last spark of mystery? And is there, perhaps, some slender, stubborn residue of the unknown that modern instruments have not yet fully captured? The longevity of the Bermuda Triangle legend is best understood as a collision between three powerful human impulses: the ancient, archetypal fear of the void. The open ocean has terrified and fascinated humanity since we first ventured beyond sight of land. It is the ultimate blank space on the map, featureless, trackless, indifferent. Unlike mountains or forests, which at least offer solid ground and visible threats, the sea gives no purchase, no landmarks, no mercy. When something disappears there, it disappears completely. No grave marker, no wreckage shrine, no final resting place that survivors can visit. The absence itself becomes the horror. Every vanished ship or plane in the triangle replays this primal dread on a modern stage. The psychological need for pattern seeking in chaos. Humans are meaning-making creatures. When random tragedies accumulate, storms, navigational errors, structural failures, human misjudgment, we instinctively look for a unifying cause. The triangle offered a satisfying narrative, not mere bad luck, but a place marked by fate, a zone where the ordinary rules of physics or probability temporarily lapse. This pattern seeking is so strong that even after individual cases are explained, the larger gestalt, the sense that something is different there, persists. It is the same mental mechanism that once produced sea serpent legends, ghost ship apparitions, and the Kraken. The cultural amplification loop created by mass media. From 19th century shipping journals to 20th century pulp magazines, from 1970s television specials to 21st century YouTube channels and TikTok compilations, every medium that can dramatize absence has dramatized the triangle. Each retelling adds emotional weight, visual iconography, golden weed mats, spinning compasses, glowing fog, and a handful of new mysterious details. The legend feeds itself. A rational explanation in a scientific journal reaches thousands. A chilling recreation on a paranormal podcast reaches millions. The feedback loop ensures survival long after the original fuel has burned away. To place the Bermuda Triangle in proper perspective, it helps to compare it with other enduring maritime mysteries that share similar DNA but never achieved the same global reach. The Mary Celeste, 1872, remains the archetype of the abandoned ship. Found drifting with everything in place except the people, she is still debated 150 years later, yet she is treated as a singular puzzle rather than evidence of a cursed region. Why? Because she appeared in one place, one time, no geographic cluster formed around her. The legend of the Flying Dutchman, a ghost vessel doomed to sail forever, dates back at least to the 17th century. It inspired operas, paintings, literature. But it is supernatural folklore, not a modern pseudo-scientific enigma tied to specific coordinates. Kraken tales, giant cephalopods capable of dragging whole ships under, flourished in the North Atlantic and off Norway. They were eventually explained as exaggerated sightings of real giant squid. The Kraken never coalesced into a defined danger zone the way the triangle did. Even the real statistical black spots of the sea, the graveyard of the Atlantic off North Carolina's Outer Banks, or the Devil's Sea, Dragon's Triangle, southeast of Japan, never captured the same imagination. The Outer Banks sinkings are attributed to shifting sandbars, storms, and the Civil War, the Dragon's Triangle to volcanic activity and tectonic rifts. Neither developed a paranormal brand identity. The Bermuda Triangle succeeded where these others did not because it arrived at exactly the right historical moment. Post-World War II, during the explosion of popular science writing, mass-market paperbacks, television, and the early space age. It offered a domestic, accessible mystery, no need to travel to remote Antarctic waters or medieval European ports. Americans and Europeans could look at a map, draw 3 lines, and feel that something uncanny was happening practically in their backyard. Another factor in its endurance is what psychologists call availability bias and confirmation bias working in concert. Every time a yacht goes missing between Miami and Bimini, a very common route for recreational boaters, or a small plane vanishes on a VFR flight from Fort Lauderdale to Grand Bahama, another heavily trafficked corridor, the triangle headline reappears. Rational explanations arrive later, often buried on page 12 or in a Coast Guard press release. The dramatic story sticks, the prosaic correction fades. So where does that leave us in the mid-2020s? The overwhelming scientific consensus is clear. Loss rates, when corrected for traffic density, are not anomalous. Most famous cases have documented natural or human causes. Modern surveillance, AIS, LRIT, satellite SAR, ADS-B for aircraft black boxes, has reduced the number of truly inexplicable disappearances to near zero. Remaining mysteries are usually private vessels or light aircraft operating under visual flight rules in marginal weather, exactly the profile one would expect to produce occasional losses without paranormal intervention. Yet a small number of researchers and mariners still argue that the region may possess genuine micro-anomalies worth studying, transient magnetic disturbances stronger than predicted by global geomagnetic models, though usually too weak to disable modern fluxgate compasses. Exceptionally high incidence of waterspouts and downburst wind events due to the confluence of Gulf Stream heat, trade wind shear, and frequent frontal passages. Rare but documented episodes of shallow water methane outgassing that can locally reduce surface tension and buoyancy, though computer models suggest the effect is unlikely to capsize anything larger than a small boat. Extremely sharp horizontal shear lines in the Gulf Stream, capable of producing 8-10 knot current differences over a few hundred yards, enough to confuse dead-reckoning navigators or disorient low-time pilots. None of these phenomena, even in combination, comes close to explaining the legend's most dramatic cases, but they do suggest that this patch of ocean is, at the very least, meteorologically and oceanographically lively in ways that reward continued observation. In the end, the Bermuda Triangle's true power may lie not in what it reveals about the sea, but in what it reveals about us. It is a mirror held up to our persistent hope or fear that something remains beyond explanation, that even in an age of satellites, algorithms, and quantum computers, a few square miles of saltwater can still hide secrets. That hope is ancient, almost sacred. It is why we still read ghost stories by flashlight, why we slow the car when passing a cemetery at night, why we look twice at an empty chair in a quiet room. The whispers that began in 1784 were never really about missing ships or malfunctioning compasses. They were about the fragility of our presence in a world that does not need us. Every time a vessel or an aircraft disappears without trace, that fragility is laid bare. And every time we invent a new explanation, rogue wave, pilot error, methane belch, we push the fear back a little further, only to see it re-emerge in the next unexplained silence. So perhaps the most honest thing we can say after more than 2 centuries of wondering is this: the Bermuda Triangle is no longer a place where things mysteriously vanish. It is a place where we remember that they still can. And in remembering, we keep the oldest maritime question alive. What happened to them out there, and why did the sea never tell? And in remembering, we keep the oldest maritime question alive. What happened to them out there, and why did the sea never tell? Let us now return one last time to the place where the long story truly began, not to a dramatic shipwreck or a screaming headline, but to something far quieter and more ordinary. It is the year 1784. The ink is still drying on the Treaty of Paris. The United States is a fragile new republic trying to stitch itself together. In Europe, the old monarchies are licking their wounds after 8 years of global war. Out on the Atlantic, merchant brigs and schooners are once again carrying tobacco, indigo, rum, timber, and dreams between ports that only months earlier had been enemy harbors. Somewhere in the broad, unmarked waters between Charleston and the approaches to Bermuda, a small vessel, perhaps a 90-ton snow-rigged brig, perhaps a two-masted schooner out of Philadelphia, sets sail on what should have been a routine passage. Her hold is filled with naval stores or cotton or salt fish. Her captain is a man of 35 or 40 who has crossed this ocean a dozen times before. The crew numbers perhaps 12. A mix of New England farm boys turned sailors, a few West Indian hands who know the currents, a young mate still learning the stars. They depart under fair winds. The log is kept in neat pencil entries. Fresh breezes from the SW, all sail set, making good way. For the first day or two everything proceeds as it should, then the wind falls light. The sea turns glassy. Sargassum weed begins to appear in long windrows, golden-brown strands that bump softly against the hull like fingers testing the wood. The captain notes it casually, weed thick about us, the same phrase that appears in hundreds of logs before and after. By the third day the sails hang limp. The horizon is empty in every direction. No other sail, no bird, no cloud shadow to break the monotony. The compass needle, usually steady, begins to wander a degree or two more than it should. The men grow restless. Someone jokes about the Flying Dutchman, someone else mutters about sirens in the weed. The captain orders extra water rationed, knowing a calm can stretch for days or weeks in these latitudes. Then nothing more is written. No further entry appears in that logbook because the logbook itself never reaches port. No Mayday equivalent is carved into a spar and set adrift. No bottle with a desperate note washes up on a Bahamian beach. No fisherman hauls in a name board or a broken oar. The ship simply ceases to exist in the records of men. A month later, the owners post a notice in a Charleston newspaper. Overdue any information gratefully received. A year later, they settle with the underwriters at Lloyd's. A widow in a small house near the Battery takes in sewing to feed her children. A father in Bristol stops asking passing captains if they have seen his son. Life moves forward, another ship sails, another cargo is loaded, the ocean keeps its silence. That single, unremarkable, undocumented disappearance in 1784 was not the largest loss, not the most tragic, not the one that made headlines. It was merely the first in a long, slow accumulation of silences that would eventually be noticed, collected, named, dramatized, debated, explained, and most importantly, remembered. From that quiet non-event in 1784, the thread runs forward. Through the first ghost ships sighted in the weed fields of the early 1800s, through the Rosalie found with canaries still singing in 1840, through the iron steamers that vanished even when they could push against the calm, through the Cyclops and her 306 souls erased in 1918, through Flight 19's 5 bombers circling in confusion under a clear December sky in 1945. Through Vincent Gatti's drawing 3 lines on a map in 1964 and giving the region its lasting name, through the bestseller boom of the 1970s, the skeptical counterattack of the 1980s, the high-profile modern tragedies that refuse to stay explained, all the way to today. When satellites watch every commercial vessel, when black boxes preserve final words, when the statistical charts show nothing unusual. And yet the phrase Bermuda Triangle can still make a room go quiet for a moment. 242 years have passed since those first faint ripples of unease. In that time, humanity has replaced canvas with steel and steam with gas turbines and nuclear reactors, learned to speak across oceans with wireless, then satellites, then instant video, mapped the seabed in high resolution, tracked every commercial aircraft in real time, built lighthouses, buoys, radar towers, Doppler weather networks, AIS transponders, ADS-B, EPIRBs, black boxes, and global search and rescue protocols that can locate a life raft beacon within minutes anywhere on Earth. We have shrunk the unknowable dramatically, and yet the story refuses to die. Why? Because the Bermuda Triangle is no longer about what the ocean does to ships and planes. It is about what the idea of the triangle does to us. It reminds us that progress is real but never total. It reminds us that statistics comfort but never fully console the families left waiting at the dock. It reminds us that every age believes it has finally mastered nature until the next silence arrives. In 1784, a captain looked at an empty horizon and felt the first faint touch of something larger than himself. In 2026, a pilot flying from Miami to Nassau can look at the same empty horizon, see the same golden weed drifting below, feel the same brief shiver, and know the name of the feeling, Bermuda Triangle. The name has changed everything. It turned scattered maritime accidents into a single, enduring story. It gave fear a postcode. It gave wonder a shape on the map, and that may be its greatest achievement. Because as long as there are people who sail, who fly, who dream of crossing open water under their own power, there will always be a part of the human heart that looks at the sea and asks the same question our ancestors asked in 1784. What if it takes me too? The answer science gives today is clear and reassuring, almost certainly not. The probabilities are known, the tools are good. The ocean is vast but no longer inscrutable, yet the emotional answer, the one we carry in the quiet hours, is different. It says, maybe, maybe not today, maybe not you, but maybe. And in that small, stubborn maybe lives the entire power of the legend. So here we are at the end of this long journey that began with one missing log entry in 1784 and ends with us here, now still talking about it in 2026. The Bermuda Triangle is not a place where ships vanish because of ghosts, portals, lost civilizations, or alien technology. It is a place where we remember that we are small, temporary passengers on a very old, very large, very indifferent ocean. And every time we tell the story, we keep that remembrance alive. Thank you for sailing this far with me. If this journey through time, loss, wonder, skepticism, and human stubbornness moved you in any way, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter of history's strangest tales. Drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? And most importantly, do you believe there's still something unexplained out there in those waters, or has science finally closed the book for good? I read every comment. Let's keep the conversation going. Until the next mystery, fair winds and following seas.